All right. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to yesterlore. Let me adjust some stuff as we get ready. Going to expand this some. There we go. I'm going to have to play a lot with the windows today because different websites giving me different situations today with where they're positioning the readings that we're going to be looking at. All right, welcome to yesterlore. I'm Grimm's lawyer, as per usual, and tonight we are starting to read something different. We are going to be reading Sir Orfeo, and I'm going to explain a bit about what Sir Orfeo is, but not too much, because we're actually going to get into reading it, hopefully pretty quickly. And I'm very excited because, honestly, when I started yesterlore, the beginning of this year, this is the kind of thing I pictured myself doing. Not that none of the stuff that we've done thus far is also something I pictured doing with this stream series type thing that yesterlore is. I definitely, think that, hello chat, I definitely think that the stuff we've read thus far is very on brand for yesterlore. I think it fits. But when I first envisioned myself doing this, it was reading old stuff, just simply reading it, and talking about things we notice while doing so in the readings. And we've done that with yesterlore, but I feel like it's going to be a little bit easier to execute that with what we're going to be reading tonight and moving forward for the most part, because we're going to be reading Middle English, which is a lot more intelligible. It's not perfectly intelligible, I think, to all native English speakers from the contemporary era, but it is, compared to Old English, a lot more understandable. So it's going to be a lot less of me breaking down the grammar of things that we're reading and that sort of thing and glossing every word, and it will be more like, here's a difficult word that might not be as readily understandable. But like many of the words that I say will be hopefully readily recognizable or guessable at least. What you're looking at right now, the manuscript that I'm showing you, is the Auchinleck manuscript. This is one of, I think, 3 manuscript copies of Sir Orfeo. It is the earliest one that we have. I think it's dated to 1330-ish. Later than most of the things that we've read, though not all. It's the latest English that we've read for sure. And the original, some people think, comes from the late 13th century, so maybe composed or first written down in the late 1200s, but our earliest copy comes from the 1330s. So it's pretty close in time. There's a big gap of time, but it's pretty close to when we think it was composed. Now, we're not actually going to be reading the poem directly from this manuscript. I'm going to zoom in a bit so you can see a little bit better. I'll move across a bit too, if it will let me do that. Oh no, it won't. But I can expand. There we go. Like I said, I'm going to be messing around a lot with this today. Alright, so these are our first few lines up here. And as you can see, it's not the easiest thing to read. Not because of the letters so much. I mean, the letters are fine. They're parsable to people who are used to reading Middle English. It's more the condition. It's actually in pretty good condition, I must say. A word that is probably pretty easy to make out is this word here, England, which is England. But I think it's going to be a lot easier if we just read it typed out. So that's what we're going to do. I just wanted to show you what the first page of the oldest manuscript that we have of this poem looks like. So I'm going to switch over to the actual website that we're going to be using to look at this. This is not me typing this time. The previous times were me having typed it out for you. This is a website that I'm actually going to put the URL to in the chat if anyone wants to read along there. It is in the chat now. It will also be, oh wait, no, that takes you to note number 1. Just ignore the hashtag 1 at the end. I'll just take that off of the URL and resend it, just because not everyone wants to necessarily go to the first note in the footnotes. I just copied the footnote again. I'm very sorry. You can see the hashtag 1 at the end and just remove that, or you could just be fine going to the first note. The first note just says, I think it's something about, what is the first note? Let's go to the first note. C note. Oh, it's about the word Yarita. Okay. Yarita, it's a manuscript thing. The notes are really useful, I will say, if you're reading this edition. This is from Anne Laskaya, and the other name is getting cut off. It's Eve Salisbury, and it's in a book called The Middle English Breton Lays, and I'm going to explain what a Breton lay is momentarily. So, a Breton lay is a genre of poem that became very popular in Brittany, which is the region of France, hence the name, Breton lay, or sometimes it's pronounced lie. It's spelled L-A-I. Sometimes it's spelled L-A-Y, and it's spelled L-A-Y in this poem too. And basically, it was a form of poetry that most people believe has Celtic origins in the British Isles, that it comes from like Wales, Ireland, Cornwall, and a lot of the content of them seems to be Celtic in origin. And Brittany is, what do you know, a Celtic region of France. Breton is still spoken there to this day. It's a Celtic language, closely related to Cornish, a little bit more distantly to Welsh. But these stories became very popular there, and from there were translated into Old French, and then spread throughout France and eventually other parts of Europe. And from there went back to the British Isles and became popular in English as well. And so we're reading an English Breton lay that potentially has, well, I mean, they're going to say that it comes from Brittany. So there seems to have been a Breton source for this poem. But it's not necessarily translated from a Breton source. It's just like the story was told in Breton, and this poet, I guess, wanted to tell their version based on what they read. It's kind of like a retelling so that it will rhyme in English. So this is our first English rhyming poem that we've had. We've had a lot of alliterative verse. Here we're going to have some rhyming verse. But the rhyme's going to be a little bit weird because it's in Middle English. So I'm going to do a little bit of explaining on how Middle English is read, kind of like I did with Old English back on our very first riddles stream. So Middle English, much like Old English, did not have a standardized spelling system. So you're going to see words are spelled in many different ways in the same page, and certainly very different from how we spell things now. But it is a little bit closer to how we spell things now. There are definitely some words where you can look at it and tell this is the English word still. Oftentimes, for example, we here. We is W-E, that's the word we. It was way in Old English too, so that was already kind of spelled the same. Not much of a change. But this here, I think the Auchenschlag, let me check. I think they did use thorn in the Auchenschlag. Yes, they did use thorn. Yeah, there's thorns here. So I think this in this edition they've rendered the thorns as ths, so we can imagine some thorns here. But some Middle English documents do use th instead of thorn. It's just kind of dependent on when it was written. Later ones are going to more consistently use thorn than earlier ones. Some words, though, are spelled a bit differently for modern English, for sure. The word you're probably seeing a lot here is sum here, sum, and this means some, like modern English some, S-O-M-E. Whoops, that's not where we want to be. So we're just going to have to get used to that a little bit. Just things, spelling is, as we've hopefully gotten used to by now with the Old English stuff, flexible. Spelling is flexible. Pronunciation, a little less so. The pronunciation of things is going to be still pretty different from modern English. But visually it will look more like modern English. It's just going to be pronounced in a very different way. A lot of the what we now call short vowels, which are actually short vowels, are pronounced similarly to some modern dialects of English. Not all, obviously, because modern English dialects vary the most when it comes to vowels. The long vowels, as we call them in modern English, long vowels in modern English are just diphthongs, actually, which means two vowels said in one syllable. All of those, or most of those, are going to be actually one vowel that is long. So you hold the vowel of like what it would be if it were short for twice as long. And the spelling of those is not always consistent, but we'll see a lot of E's at the end of words. The E's are a tricky thing. The E's at the ends of words are really there, like they're pronounced in the spoken language. However, if the following word starts with a vowel, typically you won't read it in poetry. You'll kind of be able to skip it for poetic reasons, like to preserve the meter. You can kind of skip over here, for example, where it says ifonda here. This E here, this ifonda, can be just iphoned because the next word is off. So we can actually skip the E here. And that applies across lines too. So for example, over here there's the word gil, but it's actually gil of old aventures. The other thing you're going to notice a lot more of is French words. Sometimes I'm going to say French words. They're not going to be pronounced like they are or were in French. They've been Englishified, as happens when you borrow words into a new language. You make them sound more like your own language. But they are sometimes going to sound a little bit more French-like in terms of where they're stressed than in modern English, because they are still loanwords at this point and not just part of the English language inherently. Many of them have become solidified in English at this point in time, but there's still an awareness that they are of French origin a lot of the time. It's a lot more transparent to the speakers. Not entirely, not perfectly, because it's been several generations since the Norman conquest at this point. But in terms of how to pronounce it, a lot of the time it's going to sort of reflect more of a French sound, if that makes sense. How we're going to go about reading this, I'm actually going to finally get to starting the poem, is I'm going to read sort of a section until I get to a good stopping point in terms of the rhyme and a thought being completed. And I'm going to stop, and I'm going to give people a chance to ask any specific questions, like, what does this word mean? Or things you notice. This poem, Sir Orfeo, is, I don't want to say based on, but roughly modeled around an ancient Greek myth with which many people, I think, are familiar. Not everyone is familiar with the ancient Greek myth, but it is a pretty popular Greek myth, and I'm interested in seeing if people can guess what Sir Orfeo is based on in the chat. And once you do notice what Greek myth it's being based on, then, I don't want to say based on, but like modeled around, it will be interesting to notice similarities and differences between this story and the Greek myth. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Sir Orfeo, here we go. And you feel free to ask questions while I'm reading it too. You don't have to wait for me to stop to ask questions. I just will get to them when I stop. Okay, so we're going to start. We readeth oft and findeth yerita, and this clerkes wellet wita, lies that ben in harping, ben I found of fairly thing. Some beth of wear, and some of woe, and some of joy and mirth also, and some of treachery and of guile, and of old aventures that fell wheel, and some of bordes and ribody, and many there beth of fiery. Okay, we're going to stop here on fiery, here. Someone in the chat said, Orpheus, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. Yes, Orpheus. Sir Orfeo is Orpheus. At least that's the name. And yes, it is the story of Orpheus that is going to be sort of the mythological reference throughout this poem. Do people here know the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice? Is that vaguely familiar to people? Huge win for me. Yes, congratulations, you were correct. Do people know Orpheus and Eurydice? I actually forget where the stress in Eurydice is in ancient Greek. So that's what I'm checking out right now. Because vaguely, yes. Okay, that's good. So yeah, the TLDR of Orpheus and Eurydice is, sorry, my internet's going very slow today. I want to get her name pronunciation right. I know in modern English it's Eurydice, but ancient Greek. Eurydice. Okay, there we go. Eurydice. And then it's Orpeus. Orpeus, there we go. The TLDR of Orpheus and Eurydice is they are about to get married. So Orpheus, okay, let's set him up. He's a great, legendary poet, harper guy. Greatest musician ever. And, like, literally later in one version, people are, like, throwing rocks at him, and the rocks don't hit him because they're, like, listening to his music. They're like, wait, actually, we're going to fall to the ground and listen to his music instead. Anyways, great musician, and he's about to marry his fiancée, I guess, Eurydice. They're about to get married, and then she gets tragically bitten by a snake, and thus goes to the underworld, unfortunately, as one does in ancient Greece when you die. And so he goes on a journey to the underworld, plays a beautiful song for Hades and Persephone, and then, sorry, someone in the chat says, wow, I guess they've never heard of Carly Rae Jepsen. But I'm not going to say what they actually wrote. They didn't quite say Jepsen, but I'm going to save them the embarrassment of the typo. Rocks fall to the ground when CRJ plays too, but nobody cares about that. Yeah, that's so true. Anyway, he plays such a great song for Hades and Persephone that they, like, take pity on him, and they're like, okay, we'll let you go with who was going to be your wife, so long as you don't turn back as you're leaving the underworld. And of course, the very last second, they're about to get out. Like, he gets out of the underworld, she's behind him, And that's when he's like, is she following me? He turns around and looks back, and then that's the moment where she gets like sucked back into the underworld. And it's tragic and very sad. And there's, in some versions, it goes on and like more stuff happens to Orpheus, but that's like the most tragic, basic part of the story. This Sir Orfeo is not quite the same, but there are definitely parallels to be drawn. So let's go over what he said. He said, or the poet said, "We readeth oft and findeth irrita." Wait, CRJ did the same thing actually, but she didn't turn back. Yeah, she was not tempted in the same way. So we readeth oft. We read often on findeth irrita, and find written. Kind of a cringe fell Orpheus moment, TBH. Yeah. On this clerks well it vita, and this clerks know it well. Well it no. Word order is still kind of flexible in Middle English, especially in poetry. Vita is no. And clerks. Why are we saying clerks? No one's selling anything. Clerks is just an old way to say scholars. Clerk is actually like a sort of compacted form of the word cleric. A cleric is a scholar. So, and this clerics, scholars know well. So, we read often and find written, and scholars know it well. What? What is it? Lies that been in harping. Lies that been in harping. Lays, these types of songs, these types of poems that are in harping. And I think I've talked about this before. Most poems were performed sung, and often with like lyres or harps at the time. So being in harping, being in a performance setting, been y found of fairly thing. And here found isn't found like the past of find. It's like founded on. And be founded on fairly thing. Of fair things, great things. So we often read and find written, and scholars know well, many performed songs that are based on amazing things. And the poet's going to say, what kinds of things? Some beth of war. Some beth of war. War here is war. On some of woe. And some of woe. Of horrible things. On some of joie. On mirth also. And joie, this is from French, that's joy. On mirth, some of joy and mirth also. On some of treachery. And of guile. Treachery and guile. Okay. Of aventures that fell huile. So, a lot of those words are similar to English. Aventures are adventures. That looks kind of vaguely like adventures. And that fell, this is more like that befell, like that happened. And huile here, huile is actually a word, it's sort of an Old English type meaning of huile. Huile in Old English means like a specific time. And so it's be at a time. So like once upon a time. And adventures that befell once. Adventures that happened once upon a time. And of bordes and ribody. Bordes are jokes, and ribody is ribaldry. That's another way to say humor. So he's trying to cover all the bases, all the different kinds of genres. We've got war and woe, we've got joy and mirth, we've got treachery and guile, we've got adventures, and we've got adventures like journeys, and we've got jokes and humor. All sorts of different genres we've heard about. And mani verbeth of fiery. Now, it might be tempting. So, and many there be of fiery. This word is spelled just like the modern English word fairy, but the meaning is a little bit different here. Fiery has two possible meanings. In one of them it is pretty similar to modern English. But I think here it's not exactly the same as modern English meaning. The word fi or fey, it depends on the time period how you pronounce it. We pronounce it fey nowadays in English, and it can be spelled a couple ways, F-A-Y or F-A-E, depending on how fancy someone wants to be. That refers to the creatures that probably come to mind when you see the word fairy nowadays. They're the magical creatures, magical beings. Notably, they're not always tiny, and they do not always have wings. They're more like somewhere on the spectrum between the fairies with wings that you're picturing and like Middle-earth elves from Lord of the Rings. Like that sort of, it's sort of in between those two things. They're like ethereal beings. You might think of nymphs, maybe, if you're more familiar with like Greek mythology. That sort of being is what's referred to with the word fae. And many people think that there's sort of a confluence of sort of sources of this reference here, with like some elements of Celtic ideas about the fair folk that do come from like older Celtic stories, and on the other there's like Germanic ideas of elves coming in as influence, and then you have like the Greco-Roman like nymphs and sylphs and that kind of thing also being an influence. And indeed, the word fae, it's fée now in modern French. It comes from the Latin word fata, which means fates, the fates, like the ancient Roman women who controlled people's fate, hence the word fate. Fate is related to fae. But the word shifted in meaning from meaning those specific sort of goddess-type beings to just any kind of ethereal, magical creature that we now call fairies. So those are fae. So fairy, fairy, which some people spell F-A-E, sometimes they put like two little dots on it, R-I-E, or with a Y at the end sometimes. I just put it in the chat. That is the land of the fae. It's fairy. Sort of like you have the verb eat, and then you could go to an eatery to eat. Or you have the word for book. In Old French, that's libre. And then you can go to the librairie to buy a book in Old French. And that's where we get the word library, but you don't buy books at libraries, usually in English. But as most Romance language speakers will know, the word that sounds like library in Romance languages means bookstore, typically. So it's kind of that same suffix there on fae becoming fairy. So it's the place where fae live. Now that becomes less transparent when you borrow it from French to English. And so then the word fairy starts to mean both the place where fae live and another word for fae. And it eventually becomes the more common word for fae. The word fairy is a lot more common now than the word fae is. Although fae in the last couple decades has made a comeback because of like certain media has brought it back into the consciousness. The word fae has become a little bit more well-known than it used to be. All that to say that the word fairy here can refer to both the place and sort of the vague idea of fairiness, and therefore, by extension, can refer to a fairy or specific fairies. But most of the time, it's going to mean the place. And I think it's pretty clear that they mean the place here. So there's many tales of war and woe, many tales of joy and mirth, many tales of treachery and guile, many tales of adventures, many tales of humor, and many there are about the fairy realm. There are indeed, and we're going to read a bunch of them because it's fun. So, and Sir Orfeo is our first one that we're going to be reading. So, we're going to try to figure out what are fae like in these poems, and that's going to be a lot of fun. So, let's do this. We've got our sort of setup. And this is a kind of setup that you see a lot in like Middle English poetry and just old poetry in general. There's like a sort of context. They're trying to lay context. Like, it's very meta. the poet is starting to perform, and so they're saying, you've heard many tales of this and that and this, now I'm going to tell mine. That's sort of the area of the poem we're still in. We haven't even gotten our title character yet, but we will soon. So, many tales of fiery. Let me scroll down. Let me make sure you can still see it, though. You still can't see it. Okay, I need to go down a little bit. Here we go. We're at of all things at the top. Of all things that men saith, mest of love, forsooth they baith. Okay, this is our final genre. Honestly, I should have stopped here probably. Of all things that men say, men tell, most of love, in fact, forsooth, they baith. So, the most of all, the most popular genre is probably the love story, especially this time period. After this sort of period where the Breton lay was really popular in Middle English, romances became really popular. Not romances like love romance, but just like that genre of chivalric poetry, and we're going to read some of it. And then they inject a lot of what we now call romance into them. There's a lot of love that sweeps the nation. But already at this point, they're saying most of all, people like to hear stories about love. This story is going to have some love in it. It's going to be some romance element, but it's not... I think it's a big part of this story, but let's continue on. In Bretagne, this lies were rocht, first I fond and forth I brocht, of avontours that fell bedias, whereof Bretons maked her lias. Okay, I'll stop there. So in Brittany, like I was saying, in Brittany, these lays, these stories, were wrought. These stories to which I'm going to allude, first created, founded upon, and brought forth of adventures that happened, bedias, in those days, by days, whereof Britons made their lays. Here we have her, and this is an old pronoun. We do see they used here, they, and they is borrowed from Old Norse. But the older plural in Middle English, the plural of like he and heo in Old English, at this point in time, he and heo have both become he, so it's going to be a little bit ambiguous sometimes about the gender of the person being talked about. But the plural of that is typically he, and so there would be her here. So at this point in time, Middle English poets were kind of using both pronouns interchangeably. There wasn't really a difference. They were just sometimes they use one, sometimes they use the other, which is pretty fun, but it does make it confusing. It's not her lays, it's their lays, plural. Where Britons made their lays. When Kingus micht over I her, of any mervals that there were, fai token an harp, in glay and gamma, and maked a lie and gaf it nama. No of these avontours that were in falla, I can tell some, ac nocht alle. Ac herkneth, lordinges, vat ben trouwe, I chill, jo tella of sir erfewe. Okay, we finally get our title character here. So we've got, when kings may over here over, like over here, something somewhere, of any mervals, of any marvels, thought there were, don't think of the comics, just any marvelous thing that happens, any marvels that there were, they took a harp, they tolken a harp, in glay and glam, and glee and game. In glee is the old word for singing. In singing and gamma, it is where we get the word game from, but it's just sort of more generic joy, merry-making, entertainment. So in singing and entertainment, and made a lay, and gave it a name. So he's saying, when kings heard a tale, they would take up a harp. So kings, any MCU thing happens, any DC thing happens. Yeah, if any MCU thing or DC thing happens, a king has to pick up a harp and start singing. It's the law. Gods. Okay. So, but he's saying an interesting thing, the poet. Also, I'm saying he because it's an assumption that most people make here. I don't think it's a fair assumption because some of the poems we're going to read are actually by women, composed by and probably performed by women. So it's probably bad that I'm using he. That's just the convention. People typically refer to this poet as he. And there are some reasons people make that assumption given how the women are written here, but it's not necessarily a fair assumption. I'm gonna move forward with they for the poet here. The poet is saying an interesting thing here. When kings hear stories, they take up harps. That's not necessarily reality. This is like a kind of AU. Oh, there's a question in the chat. Is that where Glee Club comes from? And Glee the show? Yes. It's called Glee Club because it's the club where you sing. Because Glee is the old word for like choir. Choir is from a Greek, or no, not Greek, a French borrowing from Latin from Greek. It's like a Greek word for crowd that in Latin becomes a word for like chamber singers, and then in French it becomes the word that we know as choir, and we borrow that word for choir. So before that, the word for like choir is, or just like any kind of performance art, was gleo in Old English. Gleo was what you call performance singing, and a gleoman was a singer, entertainer. There were a lot of different words for music and a lot of different words for entertainers, but gleoman was one. And gle is what it becomes in Middle English, and then it becomes glee in Modern English. So yes. So this is this kind of nice little fantasy AU where kings are going around performing with harps, which is kind of cute. And we're not getting a king, though. We're getting a Sir orfeo. And here we get our first example of extremely willy-nilly spelling, because literally on the next line he spells Orfeo differently. He spells it up here because it rhymes better with treu here. Now of this adventure that had happened, I can tell some, ak, and ak is that Old English word we had for but, and it still means but in Middle English, ak nocht alle, but not all. I can tell some of the story, but not all of it. Ak herknes, but hearken, lordings that are true, his audience, I'm assuming. Ichil, I will. This is a contraction that I think we should bring back. Sometimes it would just be written chill, where that I and ichil is dropped. So chill, it's I will. And in Old English, you might remember each is o, each is I, and then will, and it's like each will, kind of contracted into just ichil, which is kind of cool. Ichil yotel, I will tell you of Sir Orfeo. And here, Orfeo, it looks a lot more like we would expect, like Orpheus to look like Orpheus or something. But it's been sort of romancified into Orfeo here. And I think most of the poem calls him Orfeo. I think he's almost trying to, like, make it sound more Frenchy here or something. But I really think, they are making it just rhyme with treu by having it Sir Orfeo. Okay. Let's start with this Sir Orfeo here. Orfeo mest of anything loved the glee of harping. Orfeo most of anything loved the glee of harping. He loved that harp. It's all over it. Sicker was every gold harper of him to have much honor. Okay, so sicker is a very, very old way to say, like, certain, or true, or like sure or true. Sickerly is like surely or truly. It is actually harkening back to the origin of the word sure. Actually, sure is from French sûr, and that word in itself comes from the Latin word securus. So it's secure, sicker. It's secure. You're secure in the knowledge of it, so therefore it is sure. So sicker was every good harper. So every good harper was sure. Me when I love harping. I love that. Every good harper was sure of him to have much honor. Everyone did him much honor. He had a lot of respect amongst the harper community, which according to this poet, was large and made up of kings, I guess. Himself he learned for to harp, and laid thereon his wit is sharp. He learned so there nothing was a better harper in no place. In all the world was no man bore that honest Orfeo sat before, and he might of his harping hair, but he should sense that he were in on of the joys of paradise, switch melody in his harping is. Okay, so he taught himself how to harp. He was self-taught harper, and he applied his sharp wits, and in no place was there anyone who could come before him in all the world, just piling on the superlatives. He's the best. So, let's go down. And we see Orfeo actually was a king. So he's Sir Orfeo, but he is a king. So this harkens back again to what the poet said before, with kings love to harp. They love to pick up harps when they hear stories. So now we have made Orfeo a king. So Orfeo was a king in England on a high lording. So he was a king in England. He was a high lording. Okay. King in England. Don't remember that part of the Greek myth, but that's fine. A stalwart man on hardy bow, large on courteous he was also. So, a stalwart man and hardy bow. Bow is both. Large and courteous he was also. He was large and courteous also. So, he's the best harper. He's a king. Everyone loves him, and he's polite. He's a cool guy. Everyone likes him, and he's nice to everyone. Courteous, courtly. Large here probably means like magnanimous, like he would be generous with his wealth as a king. He wasn't one of those tyrants. Again, piling on the superlatives. He was a good king. He was loved to be in the Glee Club and the Harper Club. Okay. His father was common of King Pluto, and his mother of King Juno. This is interesting. So, Pluto, that's a Roman god. Does anyone here know who the Greek god that the Romans associated with? Pluto. I'm not going to read that. I'm not going to read what someone just wrote in the chat. That's great. Yeah, it does seem like the author is really a big fan of Orpheus. King Pluto, that's interesting. So Pluto to the Romans is Hades to the Greeks. And if you remember the story of Sir Orpheus that I sort of gave the TLDR of earlier, Hades is the one that Orfeo goes. Hades rules the underworld, which is also called Hades, and sings to Hades to get his wife to be able to leave. Okay, so here we're saying that Orpheus is actually the son of a king named Pluto, or at least son of someone who was a descendant. His father came of King Pluto, so he's a descendant of King Pluto. Okay, so there's a king named Pluto, just so happens to be called Pluto, of whom he's a descendant on his father's side. And then we have his mother is of King Juno. Juno is a goddess of, a lot of things, but she's famous for being Jupiter's wife. And if you know your Greek mythology, Jupiter is associated with Zeus. Juno is Hera in that scenario. And Hera doesn't come into like the main part of the Orpheus story. So interesting that Juno's being invoked here as a king of all things. King Juno. I definitely know there's someone currently in the chat who appreciates the concept of a King Juno. Anyways, his mother was a descendant of King Juno. Okay, so we've got a King Pluto and a King Juno. Okay. That some time were as goddess I hold, for aventures that I did and told. Okay, so here we get one sort of medieval perspective on pagan gods. At this point, Christian is composing this. We're certain, pretty much, that a Christian is composing this. So, one thing that medieval Christians like to do with pagan deities is they like to go back and say, okay, they existed, but they were just people that were so popular and so famous that people considered them to be gods. And that's what he's saying. That some tima were as goddess yehol. That some people held them as gods. Some people considered them gods once upon a time. So at some time they were gods for adventures that they did and told. So they did such awesome things that people considered them gods, but we medieval Christians know better now. So this is like the true story. And that's what we get in a lot of these medieval, especially Middle English stories. It's like, you've heard of this ancient Roman myth, but I'm about to tell you the true story about it. And it ends up being kind of funny from a modern perspective to see that. So, this king sojourned in Thracians, that was a city of noble defense. Where was it? Oh yeah, for Winchester was cleped though, Thracians, without him know. So, apparently he's saying the city of Winchester in England at the time was called Thracians, at the time of whenever Orfeo was king, I suppose. I'll actually need to look into this. I don't actually know if there was ever a time when Winchester was called this. Like if this is some Roman name, like some Roman settlement. I don't know. Actually, I'm going to have to check that. But this is interesting, that he's giving it sort of like a fantasy name, at least from the perspective of the modern or contemporary Middle English audience. Yeah. I see those eye emojis at the word Winchester. Yes, the city of Winchester in England. So, oh yeah, and clepid here means called. Klipan is an Old English word for to like name someone, like to refer to something, and that's what's happening here. Okay, the king had a queen of priests. Had a queen of priests is from the French word, Old French it's priests, and modern French it's prix, which is where we get the word price. So he had a queen of price. But here price is not literal. He just means she's a queen of awesomeness. She's high quality queen here. That was Yclepid Dam Herodis, or Eurodis. I'm not sure if we should be pronouncing that H or not. It could be silent, borrowed from French, because her original name is Eurydice, or Eurydike in Greek. But it's Herodis here. It seems to come from Eurydice, but they've like changed it quite a bit. Eurodis. Dam Herodis. The fairest levity for the nonus. Okay, so the fairest levity, and you're going to see levity a lot. Levity is where the word lady comes from. The fairest levity for the nonus, that micht gone on body and bonus, full of love and godliness. Ac no man might tell her fairness. So, yeah, so she was the fairest lady that might go, in body and bone. So, physically, she was the fairest lady to walk about in the physical world. And this is important because we're going to get fairy later. Full of love and goodness. She's full of love and goodness. Not much to sort of translate there. Ac no man might tell her fairness. Nobody can describe or tell her beauty, her fairness. Okay. Here we go. Befell so in the commencing of May, when merry and hot is the day, and away beth winter shores, and every feld is full of flowers, and blossom breme on every bough, over all wexeth merry a nocht. This each queen, Dam Herodis, talk to maidens of priests, and when in an undren tide, to ply be an orchard seed, To se the flores sprede on spring, and to hear the foles sing. Okay, let's pause there for a second. Because there were, I think, some words that might not be as obvious here. So, befell, so in the coming of May, we could just say the coming of May. Coming is more like the onset of it. In the onset of May, the beginning of May, when merry and hot is the day, and away be the winter showers. And every field is full of flowers. I'm kind of just modern Englishifying what we just read. And blossom bream in every bough. Bream here is just like, bream in Old English is more like noble, but here it's more like bright, shining. Bright, shining flowers, blossoms in every bough. Over all waxeth merry enough. Everything, everywhere, everything grows enough. It waxeth, it waxes like the moon waxes, it gets bigger. This, each queen, dam Herodes, this I queen, I'm actually not sure how to parse the each here. Oh, this is each like each in Old English. It's the same. This same queen, Dame Herodes, took 2 maidens of pris, of excellence again, pris, and went in an undren tid to ply by an orchard side. Okay. They went in an undren tide. Undern is an old word for the period that's roughly 9 a.m. to like noon. It's late morning. The Old English sort of day is roughly split into like 3-hour intervals for which there's like a word or two to refer to them. And undern or undertid is one that refers from like sort of 9ish to 12. And that survived into Middle English as undertid. I think we should bring back those terms. Because they're useful. 3-hour intervals. And they went in late morning to play. And play doesn't necessarily literally mean they're playing games, but just sort of enjoying themselves. It's May. So people in May would go out to celebrate. You know, there's things like maypoles that people would, you know, dance around and stuff. May was just the time where you celebrate winter being over. May Day exists for that reason. Beltane is another sort of celebration in early May around the same kind of thing. And there was this tradition of what was called Maying, where you go out and just enjoy the spring, basically. And that's what they're doing. They're playing, they're having fun by an orchard side. Orchardside. To see the flowers spread in spring. See the flowers spread in spring. Okay. And to hear the foles sing. Foles are, this is where we get the word fowls, but still in Middle English, the word fowl just means any bird. It doesn't have to specifically be like chickens and that kind of thing. It's any bird. Okay, so what happens next? If I set him down all three, sorry, I want to make sure you can still see this. Okay, we're still good. If I set him down all three under a fire impetre, and well soneth his fire queen fell on sleep upon the grain. The maidens durst her not to wake, but let her lie and rest take. So she slept till afternoon, that undertide was all ye done. Actually, I'll stop there, because what happens next is kind of dramatic, so we want to be able to focus on that. So, they set themselves down, all three, under a fair impetre. Now, this imp here, imp, is where we get the word imp from, but I don't want it to be confused because this is not, it has nothing to do with imps in the modern, like, smiley devil emoji sense. Imp means a seedling, a kind of like sapling, and it's from that sort of meaning that, like, the sense of like seedling or evil seed of demons or something becomes our modern word imp. But imp at this period in time still means a sort of sapling. So an impetre is actually like when you, what's it called? It's like when you graft a tree. Oh yeah, there's a note right there. This is grafted tree. I'm taking all this time to explain it. Just it's right there. If you're following along on the website, you can see. So it's a grafted tree. So you've like cut a sapling and like grafted it onto another thing. So that makes sense because they're in an orchard, which would be sort of like artificially created. So she's sitting under a beautiful orchard tree here. That's all impetre means. And well sown this fire queen. Well sown is like a way of saying like very soon, like very quickly. Fell on sleep. She fell asleep upon the green. The maidens durst her not awake. They dared not awake her. They durstn't awake her. But let her liga on the rest taka. They let her liga. Liga is, lijan in Old English means to lie down. So that's the descendant of that. They let her lie and take rest. So she slept till afternoon. That undertide, that undertide, that early morning, here it's spelled a little bit differently, but it's the same word, was all done. Until it was all done. So, it's afternoon now. So, she's taken a nice little nap until afternoon. What happens then? Ak as son a she gan awaka, she cried, and lothly bear gan maka. She frotted her handen on her fate, and cratched her visage, it blade weight. Her riche robe, he all torret, and was reveid out of her wit. The two maidens here beside no durst with her no longer bide, but orn to the palace full richt, and told both the squire and knecht that her queen awayed wold, and bade him go and here at hold. Knechtes orn and levides also, damosel 60 and mo. In the orchard to the queen he come, and her up in her arms nom, and brought her to bed at a last, and held her there fine fast. Okay, let's stop there because we're going off the page. So, as soon as she woke up, she cried, and there's going to be some brief mention of blood here, so just be aware. She cried, and loathly bear gun mix. She made bear. She like bore out. She cried out. She frotted her handed. She frotted her hands. The word fraught has narrowed in meaning over time. Does not mean what it used to mean anymore, but it does still have this meaning of rubbing. She rubbed her hands and her feet and scratched her face. It bled wet. It was bleeding. And a rich robe he all torret. She tore all the pieces of her clothes and was reveid out of her wit. She was reveid. She was pulled out of her wit. She was basically driven insane, I think is the implication here. What happened? The two maidens that were beside her dared not stay there. They did not long abide there. They didn't want to stay there any longer. But orn, they ran. This is an example of like R being switched with a vowel. This happens a lot in Old English. Over the period of Middle English, it goes from being more common to being less common to the point where we just say ran nowadays, but it could still be orn here. And we see orn spelled as a U down here. But both ran to the palace full richt right away and told both squire and knight that their king awayde wold. Awayde is a way of saying she went mad. That's like what that means in Middle English, is that she went mad. And bade him go and here at hold her down, like grab her, because she's like kind of harming herself and they want to stop it. So knights ran, and ladies also damsels 60 and more. And in the orchard to the queen they came, and Noma her up in her armes. Naman means to take, or it's Neman actually, Nom is the past. So they took her up in their arms. We can see the her gets confusing here, right? And her up in her arms. They took her up in their arms and brought her to bed at last and held her they're fast. We'll see. Usually her, when it's actual modern English her, is spelled with an I, because it typically is in Old English too. It's usually hira in Old English, whereas her is more common for they, because in Old English it's heura with an E. So not always consistent, so it gets a little confusing like here, but up here was still pretty clear. Told them to hold her here. But here in this line it gets a little confusing. But, so, they go there and they grab her. On held her there fin fast. Hold her fast. Very fast. Fast as in fastened. Like, secure. Ak ever she held in o kri, and wold up and o we. So, but ever she kept crying, she persisted, she wanted to get away. She didn't like to be held down. I know it's 8 after 4, or 4 after 8. So I'm going to finish this section, and then I think we'll stop there. We'll stop at 99, I guess. When Orfeo heard that tiding, never him nas worse for nothing. When he heard that tiding, never him nas worse for nothing. He'd never been worse for nothing. Like, nothing had ever been as bad of news as that to him. This is his wife, and he is hearing that this horrible thing has happened. Why did that happen? What's going on? She fell asleep and she woke up harming herself, and not in a good state. And on that cliffhanger, I suppose we will be left off. Worry not, that part of the story does get resolved pretty soon. It does not stay about finding out what happened to her. We find out pretty quickly what happened to her, and she'll be okay. I will give that spoiler. She'll be okay. But we will return to finding out what happened to her next week when we continue with Sir Orfeo. Thank you for everyone who is here in person, and anyone watching this asynchronously, thank you. Please leave comments in, well, the YouTube comments below, and like and subscribe, all that good stuff. And join us next week if you can for part 2 of Sir Orfeo. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of whatever time zone you're in. Farewell.